Welcome to Victor's Children, a podcast from so-called Canada talking socialism from below. My name is David Canfield. I live with my partner and cat in Winnipeg, Manitoba, which is in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of Anishinaabe, Cree, Ojibwe, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. All those of us in the Canadian state who aren't Indigenous need to commit ourselves to the struggle against settler colonialism. Victor's Children is a member of the Harbinger Media Network, a community working to promote left podcasts in Canada. Check out the list of Harbinger podcasts at harbingermedianetwork.com. There's been a small but significant growth in interest in workplace organizing among leftists in so-called Canada in recent years. I think it's at a lower level than what we see in the United States, where there's, for example, the Emergency Workers Organizing Committee, or EWOC, and other initiatives. There's a higher level of interest and activity, but there's been growth here too. In 2024, the unionization win at an Amazon warehouse in Laval, Quebec, to which members of the group Alliance Ouvrière were central, that boosted interest in workplace organizing. Unfortunately, I think, as listeners will probably know, Amazon has recently decided to close all its Quebec facilities rather than allowing workers to get a collective agreement at that one facility. But today, few young leftists who want to get jobs in unionized workplaces in order to get involved in union activity, or who go into non-unionized workplaces in order to organize there for unionization, have the benefit of learning from radicals with a lot of workplace organizing experience. There's really not very much in the way of multi-generational political organizing among radicals, and even informal political relationships across generations are pretty weak, and I think that explains the situation. But as a contribution to try to address this issue, I'm delighted to have two people with a lot of workplace organizing experience join me as guests on this episode of Victor's Children. So could you please introduce yourself to listeners?
Steve Downs. I am a retired New York City train operator. And while I was there in the as a train operator, I also served on the local's executive board and was chair of the train operators division, representing about 3,500 people. And for the relevance, I guess, to this topic is I was a part of that generation of leftists in the States anyway, in the 70s, who made sort of collective decisions to get jobs in industry, what we called at the time in industry, to do political organizing.
Let me just add that Steve's the author of a pamphlet called Hell on Wheels, The Success and Failure of Reform in Transport Workers Union Local 100, which you can find if you look on the internet. And
my name is Katherine Grezjszczak. I have worked as a paramedic since 2010. I initially was at U of T getting a sociology degree. In the very early 2000s, was active with leftists and socialists against the war in Iraq at the time. I got involved with union organizing at the U of T campus. I believe that was Unite Here at the time. That was organizing food service workers. I subsequently got an organizing position with SEIU Local 1. It was a really bad experience. I was terminated during my probationary period and promised myself that I would not be a staffer for a union ever again, but was still really interested in doing activism through the union just as a frontline worker. I ended up going into a paramedic program just as a complete fluke. A leftist friend of mine was doing it and suggested that I should do it as well. And really actually liked the work of being a paramedic. And so I worked up on reserve in Northern Ontario for a year in 2009, and then subsequently have been working since that time, since 2010, as a paramedic in a GTA service, a large service. I was initially the lead steward for a bargaining unit of about 2,000 workers for the first 6 years that I was active in my union, and then was subsequently elected as president in late 2018. I have been the president of a large municipal composite local that includes municipal employees, library employees, and that chapter is now coming to an end. I think we did some really successful, actually, work within that local. So successful that it garnered a lot of opposition. And unfortunately, my own bargaining unit is splitting from the local. So I will no longer be the president, and the future of my union activism is up in the air. So it'll be interesting to see what happens in the near future. My plans right now is that I will be going back into my workplace as a paramedic, which I should say I was on a union leave as the president since late 2018 up until this point in time.
Okay, well, thanks both. And let's dive in here. To start off with, many radicals today don't see workplace organizing as important. And I think we can understand this by thinking about the low level of workplace struggle, the weakness of unions, and the decline of politics that treat class struggle as central to changing society. So if you're asked the question, why is workplace organizing important? How would you answer that?
I probably would have answered it differently just a few months ago. But now I would say Elon Musk and Doge. I mean, if there were a more aggressive, if there had been in place a larger cohort of radicals and leftists who have been doing organizing at the workplace and in their unions, the response to the right-wing assault that we're facing in the States, I think, would be very different, would be more militant, and would have that that element of it that of the either the threat of or the reality of slowdowns and strikes and workplace actions that would have, I think, a real potential for throwing obstacles in their way.
So, I mean, look, anybody who understands capitalism and wants to change, the fundamental inequalities that are built into capitalism, I think you understand that production and the relationships of production are at the heart of this economic and political system, whether you work in the private or the public sector. And it's the workplace is based on interactions of oppression and force. And we spend most of our waking hours within those types of interactions. And by their very nature, they always generate resistance. Where people are oppressed, they will resist. And so the workplace will always be a site of that type of resistance, even if, as you say, David, and I, totally agree, it is a site of weak resistance at the moment. Even if you look at the rise in the number of strikes and job action in the last few years, which I've certainly not seen that level of workplace action in my lifetime. But even though there has been this spike, when you look at what are we actually winning, and it's not like we're asking for anything, that would fundamentally change society. Workers are striking just to rest, even the most minor of concessions, which are related to wages and inflation, right? These strikes are not about addressing the homelessness crisis, about the deterioration of public services, which has just worsened with the pandemic. The asks are so small, right? And workplace actions are not by sector. They're based in individual workplaces. They're fragmented, right? They're very sporadic. There's no bigger plan or program of how this ties into improving our living conditions. But I think from a strategic perspective, though, I think disruptions at the point of production are the most effective tool that we have to disrupt capitalism and to try to build a different economy, a different dynamic. But also, I think if you're an activist, there's such a tremendous skill set to be learned from workplace organizing. When you are in a workplace, you have to work with people who are not like you, who don't think like you, who have very different values from you. And your only commonality is you were both hired by the same employer. You find yourself in this situation, and you have to try to build relationships with folks that are very different than you and talk to them and strategize with them and try to build some sort of collective action to improve what's happening in your workplace. That's a skill set that is specific to workplace organizing, which is very different from other modes of organizing where people find themselves based on their commonalities. And that's a very different dynamic.
Steve, do you have any thoughts on that question of learning from workplace organizing?
Yeah, I mean, I think Katherine is absolutely right. It's very, how to put it? Look, I was, as I mentioned, I was in the New York City subway for 30 some years. So the workforce, about 40,000 people working in transportation and subways and buses in New York City in our local, predominantly Black or Latino membership. And I'm not neither. So to be able to come in and do political organizing, David mentioned a pamphlet I wrote earlier called Hell on Wheels. Hell on Wheels was the name of a newsletter and a caucus that existed that we built, and we being, a handful of, at first, other leftists, and then we succeeded in building a base among active members in the local, and eventually succeeded in winning control of the local. Kind of went downhill from there, but that's another story. But all that sort of by way of saying that couldn't have happened without me as an individual, and also the other people who were like me, who were college-educated leftists who came into the job to do political organizing, successfully making the connection with the rank and file members who did not come from that background, to find a commonality with them, to work with them to build organizing structures or structures of resistance, to carry out job actions when we were just a small minority. And so all those, I think, that all that happened, and those skills were learned, and it paid off both on in the workplace, on the trains, on the buses, as a union officer, but also it meant that we then had connections that we could build in the communities at large.
Okay, so moving on, I'd like you to both talk about what kind of unionism you think radicals should be trying to foster when we are in workplace organizing, and how that's different from the kinds of unionism that people are going to be most familiar with, the dominant approaches to unionism in the US and Canada.
I could try at that a little bit, I think, first. I think as radicals, you want to build organizing that actually challenges the employer and makes meaningful and significant and material gains for workers. And that's actually very different than, you want to call it business unionism, the predominant unionism that functions within a legal framework that's really hampered by the law, that has very narrow parameters in terms of what is even a gain that unions should be looking at making, that predominantly focuses on wages, overtime pay, pensions, vacation, all of which are really important things, but that doesn't really touch at the power relationship between workers and the employer, doesn't address really important issues like scheduling, for example, workers having some sort of degree of control in the workplace, staffing issues, all of which are even within business unionism seen as the purview of the employer to run their operations, but which are actually really determining of our living conditions as workers. And so I think fundamentally just organizing to actually challenge the power relationship in a real way between workers and the employer, rather than saying all of these things are just off the table and that's not even an option to talk about, right? Being open about the relationship with the employer rather than making decisions behind closed doors as elected union officers, involving members in every decision that gets made, empowering workers to, again, collectively challenge that power relationship between us as workers and the employer. And that is not the structure of the unions that we operate within when we think about a formal union, all the legalities that come with it.
It seems like a softball question from you, David, but as I think about it, it's not really. Either one of us could answer that by saying, we need unions that are more militant and more democratic and participatory, and use all these phrases, and then and it would be true, but it sort of doesn't. Those answers don't speak to the process involved in making those things happen. And the reason I'm saying it like that is that, and I'm only speaking from my own experience. I don't want to generalize at all, but my own experience. So we had this militant core of activists who fought on the job and engaged in slowdowns and built a caucus that eventually took control of the local, and then was running stewards training and doing all this other stuff. and these were by and large, they were politically engaged people, whether they considered themselves socialists or not. Some yes, some no. But it was also the case that what probably a majority of our members wanted was a union that would answer their phone calls and show up when they had problems and would negotiate, more money in the contract and better benefits. And they were happy to go along with the more militant actions, when it seemed that was the way that you get those better contracts. But they wouldn't necessarily agree to participate in militant actions if the goal was we're going to have an input into the schedule of the trains and buses, or if the goal was going to be something has to be done about the guy who was arrested at Columbia University and things like that. So there's a disparity between sort of the militant and political vision that the union activists, whether leftists or not, often have, and what the members want from their officers. They want more militant, honest, engaged officers, and that will vote out the people who aren't that. But that doesn't mean that it's sort of how we get to the point where the members are going to share some of that broader vision and feel they have a stake in having a more participatory union, or one that is prepared to throw down in struggle over political issues, is certainly not something that we were able to resolve.
But at least I think it's worth mentioning that you had an understanding about what kind of unionism you were trying to promote that poses the question, right? Which I think is worth noting. Catherine?
No, but I think Steve said something that's actually really important, which is connecting unions and workers and the work that we do to the needs of the community, and structuring public services in such a way that they actually provide for the needs of the community. And that is certainly not in any meaningful way at the moment something that's on the table. And that is very difficult to build, right? Precisely because there is no broad class consciousness, I think, if you will, in the simplest way of saying it, that workers don't see that connection. And Steve is right, whether that was the case when he was doing organizing, a few decades ago, or whether right now. And especially, there's been a tremendous deterioration of public services, especially intensified since COVID. They're being run like a private business. Compensation is being plowed into upper management while the frontline services are suffering. They can't recruit frontline workers. And, the quality of public services is not what it even used to be before the pandemic. And yet, that connection and that push and that, connecting unions and some of these strikes that we're seeing to community demands has not effectively happened in any real sense of the word, right? So I think that is actually fundamentally also important.
So if we think about people who are active in their unions, who are committed to the kind of approach to unionism that you've been talking about, the question about when you should or whether you should run for union office, right? Like running to be a member of the executive board on your union local. When that comes up, would you share some thoughts about how people should think about that question of running for office? So that's one where I think there are a lot of different points of view.
Sure. In the political tradition that I came out of, I was in a group called Solidarity here in the United States. We were very skeptical, let's say, about running for union office. There wasn't a bar on it. We didn't say under no circumstances, but we were very skeptical. And the reason we were very skeptical is because, at least in part, that if we were to win, then we would be administering a contract that we didn't have any role in shaping. And so it would fall to us to do the servicing and the management of the workforce that the contract requires of union reps to some degree. And certainly in a local the size of TW 100, if we had a couple reps here and there, they would have been just overwhelmed by the bureaucracy above them. So as we started organizing our caucus or organizing around contract issues and with the newsletter, we first ran for positions. I should have qualified that. We ran for positions where we didn't have a chance to win, and we did that deliberately. We ran for positions where we could use the campaign to talk about the issues that we thought the union should be doing something about, where we could use the campaign to reach out, talk to people we didn't normally see, and spread the ideas that we were building through the newsletter and talk about organizing on the job and job actions and having each other's back and that stuff. But with the expectation that we would lose and then not be responsible for the administration of the contract that the other, our opponents negotiated. That we had to change our thinking on that after like 2 rounds of elections. Or two, over like 2 or 3, let's say 3 years. And the reason we changed because the members who were starting to come around us, who were in the base that was responding to us, expected us. They wanted us to be their representatives. They expected us to run and for things that we could win, so that we would be the ones to respond when they needed help. They weren't thinking that we would be negotiating the contract, but they were tired of leaving messages for a union rep and nobody getting back to them. And they thought we would be the responsive people and that our responses would be different. And we'd come to the job and we'd be thinking in terms of organizing and not just filing grievances. So we were still far from being able to win top positions in local, but we started to win the low-level positions of executive board members or stewards, or division chairs, which I eventually became, which were really the people doing the nuts and bolts work on the job with the members. And it was really through that, in part, as well as a continuation of the rank and file work we were doing, the organizing on the job, the newsletter, and the caucus, that eventually put us in the position where we could win control of the local. But that took about 15 years.
In terms of running for positions within the union, yes, I think you do have to some extent, like at the very least, for the position of a steward. Otherwise, you're basically talking about doing organizing completely outside of your current union structure. I think what's helpful is if you run with a slate of folks. I think that's some of what Steve was talking about, whether you do it in one go or whether you move able to win elections over time. But just doing it by yourself as one individual, I think, is extremely challenging. And I think you're not going to get very far and will be extremely frustrated if you have more radical politics and are surrounded by folks on executive positions who do not. You'll be extremely limited. I think holding elected office allows you access to resources that then, you can use those resources to build more of a fighting union, to get your voice out further, rather than if you're just a member showing up at meetings, which have very limited attendance and putting forward certain, ideas or motions. When you are on a full-time union leave, depending on what you're doing on that full-time union leave, it does actually disconnect you from the workplace, right? And when you are pushing forward more confrontational politics, you will quickly build a lot of opposition internally within your union and outside of your union as well, and opposition from employers. People want to see you removed from any position of power internally within the union, and being on a full-time union leave and not being embedded in the workplace and helping folks in the workplace every day makes it a lot easier to be, to be disconnected, and for people who have different ideas about how the union should run to be able to remove you from your position, even just through elections.
I've got a specific thing I want to throw at both of you and see what you have to say, because there are some people on the left, I've certainly encountered this, who think, well, the priority, if you're a radical in a union, should be to get onto the executive, for example. And that you should therefore, when you run for a position like that, well, first of all, you should run as soon as you can. And they would say, don't be too open about what you actually stand for. Try to get on the executive, and then you can use that position to kind of make the change that you want to make, rather than running in a way where you're pretty open about your vision of unionism. Do you have any thoughts about the consequences of that approach?
Well, I mean, if you get elected on a certain politics and then you move into a space where people expect you to put forward those politics and enact those politics, and you don't, like, that just doesn't work. It fundamentally isn't going to work, right? Like, you will not be able to put those politics forward, right? Like, you need to be able to put those politics forward and be elected on those politics in order to be able to then function in that capacity after. So no, I think I fundamentally disagree that once you're there, you can then all of a sudden put forward something completely different. And also just because all of this is a collective effort, right? So like me as an individual, like there's nothing I can do in a union by myself except for put forward a certain perspective. It all relies on collective action. So I'll turn it over to Steve and see if he has maybe a different perspective.
No, not. Thank you, but no, I don't at all. I think that if you have a perspective of building something different, then it's important that if you're putting yourself forward for an elected position, that people know what you actually stand for and what they're voting for, and they won't be surprised by you suddenly talking about something different, and they feeling like that you're just another politician who will say anything to get elected. And say, okay, I voted for that person and that slate and that caucus because they represent XYZ, and that's what they're talking about, and that's what I expect of them. And it's not. I mean, every local is different, and I don't. So again, speaking from my own experience, there was there was incredible hostility between the established leadership and the people like me coming on the job and trying to organize, and that kind of never changed over 15 years. So you might as well, you're going to get elected to something, you might as well get elected for what you really stand for, and build support for that. If and then hopefully, if you get support for that, you're going to have some chance to move things. But it's not. Doesn't make it. It would not have made any sense in our local for the leftists or the critics to sort of tone stuff down and try to find a way into the good graces of the established leadership in the hope that once they're there, they can influence the leadership of the union. It wouldn't have worked. It wasn't suggested and rejected. It was something outside of what we would have considered, but it wouldn't have worked.
I should add for any listeners who might be misinterpreting what we're saying here, I don't think we're saying, of course, if you're a revolutionary socialist, that you have to run and explicitly say you're a revolutionary socialist. It's not like that. It's about running on the basis of being open about your perspective for the union, right? And for the direction you want the organization to go. Not about running on the so-called full program where you have to necessarily, we're not saying you have to out yourself.
Well, look, I just want to add something to that. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with you on that, in the sense that I personally, and most of the people I worked with, didn't hide the fact that we were socialists. We didn't wear it on our sleeves. It wasn't a big deal. But in addition to that pamphlet that David mentioned earlier, Hell on Wheels, I've written a paper on, there were, in the mid-1980s, there were a dozen, by my count, different socialist organizations with members in the New York City Transit Union. And they had, so I've written a paper sort of looking at what were their perspectives and what did they put forward. How did they deal with the question of elections? How did they deal with, did they build caucuses? Did they not? So forth and so on. And certainly I would say, although it wasn't my approach, if you're a revolutionary socialist and you think that adherence to a politics of revolutionary socialism is the key to having to being the union you want to build, then yeah, you should run on that basis. You're not likely to get very many votes, but you shouldn't hide that. And I think that was one of the things that I discuss in this paper is sort of the difference between that part of the left. It's not like there were 12 different perspectives. There was a lot of overlap with some of the groups. That part of the left which said, look, our focus, we're socialists and we are committed to a revolution at some point, but right now what we need to do is build strong shop floor organization. We need to fight back against the employer we need to talk about politics, and we need to broaden the vision of what a union should deal with. So there was that set of people, and then there was a set of people who basically said every fight requires a general strike, or every fight requires socialist slogans. So that stuff is real. Those politics are there, and people adhere to it. So.
Yeah, I guess one other thing to mention before we go on is that because there are certainly lots of small locals where there are actually difficulties in finding people willing to step up and be local presidents, for example. And then I think there's a thinner layer of activists in a lot of places compared to what was the case 20 or 30 years ago. It's, I think, in some cases easier for radicals who are in unions to end up running for office unopposed because of how thin the activist layer has become. And I think then there's the risks that you end up in this kind of positions without having articulated the politics that you actually stand for the union in the way that both of you have talked about as being important. And I think that's perhaps one thing that's different from the situation a number of decades ago, at least certainly in parts of Canada that I'm familiar with. So food for thought there. Yeah.
I think I would just say that I think, it used to be the case, I would say, before the pandemic, because I think really things did change politically around that time, that the right was not actually out organizing us, right? So if you could basically just figure out a way to connect with members and put forward that we need to challenge the employer more, we need to be more representative of the members. I think it was a lot easier to win an election before the pandemic, even just on those simple terms. The right has actually gotten really organized. I would say within the Canadian state. I think the first time I really very markedly noticed it was with the Freedom Convoy. That was like the first time where there was a very clear right-wing presence that made its way into the union. And since then, the right has been getting more organized in unions. Zionism, right, has lent a lot of support, organizations that function on behalf of the state of Israel have put resources into organizing workers for a very good reason, right? They know that workers can mount an effective opposition to, against genocide in the state of Israel. And so the right is actually organized within unions. And I think that's very much so what I saw within my local, and the separation that's happening within my local is actually the right has gotten organized, and they are winning internally within unions. Whether that's part of a broader picture, like I don't want to generalize too much because every local is so specific. They have such a specific membership, but I don't think that we should discount that. So I think when I'm looking around, it used to be much easier to be able to get those positions. I think if you were just like a good, solid organizer that was even good at just representing members around workplace issues. And I'm not so sure that that is the case anymore. And I think, I think that's a trajectory that I think there's a lot more to be said about that. But there has been a shift politically, internally within unions. And the right has figured out how to organize. They're organizing successfully. And I'm not sure that that's quite registered. And yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Interesting.
All right. So I'd like to take us to the question that comes up for people who, might be fairly young and thinking about what they're going to do in terms of paid work. And maybe they're in a workplace where they don't think there's a lot of prospect of doing that. And in some cases, you get the idea that, the particular sectors or occupations are really priorities and people should change jobs to go and work in particular places. What do you think about that in general, the question about, making political decisions about where people work for pay and how people think about those kinds of issues?
I think that I think that's got to be a part of the calculation that any individual or any group makes, particularly any group or any group, and even in an informal sense, could be a group of friends who are starting to talk about doing something. I think that it makes sense to think about where in my city or my town do I think I could be most effective? And if it's not where I'm working now, is there a way to get there? Having said that, I don't want to exaggerate that, because I got the job in transit because I was unemployed, and I looked up. I was riding the train one day, and there was a sign saying New York City Transit now hiring. I knew the city's, I knew the subway system would be important, but I got it as, I didn't go in with a group of people. I went in mostly because I needed a job. It was a job that would clearly have a potential to be a place where I could do political work, but it wasn't the result of some long thought out process. So it probably is more the case that I was open to this kind of job because of having thought about what kinds of job, what kind of work would be both I could support myself and would be interesting and would be a site for political activity, more than sat down and figured out, well, I want to be a subway worker as opposed to being a teacher or something else. So I think that there's like I said, that has to be part of the calculation. It probably shouldn't be decisive if there are other things weighing on people, especially, the scheduling, there's demands on your time, demands on your family. Is this something you can sustain over a period of years? I started the job in 1982. I frankly didn't think I'd be there longer than 5 years. I figured I'd get fired for political activity, and that didn't happen. It is really hard to get fired from a civil service job here. Let me tell you that. And then there's a whole experience of a layer of activists a little bit older than me who said, "Oh, let's get jobs as steel workers." And they went into the steel industry, and they were involved in some really exciting stuff. And then the steel industry, at least in the United States, cratered, and that all their plans and expectations came to naught. So,
David, could you just repeat the question again?
Sure. Yeah, just about what you think about the issue of changing jobs to get involved in organizing in a particular workplace, and just in how people think about job choice. When it comes to people who want to be active politically at work. Because sometimes I think there are these ideas about, go work in this particular sector, this particular industry, and that's really the key priority, or other people who say it doesn't really matter and we need radical organizers everywhere. So, what are the kinds of things people might want to think about, particularly when they're young and thinking about these kinds of things?
It does have a lot to do with, these are major life decisions, right? Like, this is where you spend a lot of time. You have to choose something that like Steve said, that you find interesting, that you feel like you can actually do that work. That's important. And then I think you get into this conundrum of, if I go and get a job that makes over 100K, where there's relatively good working conditions, because I know I can do that for, the next 15, 20 years, then again, how much interest is there going to be to challenge an employer in an occupation like that, right? Whereas opposed to if you go to get a job that's, low paid, hyper exploitative, it would probably be a lot more fertile ground for workplace organizing and some real fights against an employer. But how easy is it to sustain yourself in that kind of employment in the longer term? So yeah, there's a ton of considerations. I don't think there's an easy answer to that. I think also doing it with a group of folks makes it so much easier, right? Where you're not isolated, like you're constantly being a radical in these kinds of positions. You're constantly fighting against the grain. It's extremely tiring, right? Like people will fight against you. The employer doesn't like you. You have folks internally within the union that don't like you. You need such a tremendous base of support to be able to really accomplish anything in these positions. So, I think there's so many considerations there. There's no easy answer to that question, but also just union work can be really soul sucking a lot of the time. And so being able to do activism in other parts of the community as well, and not just through your union, I think really goes a long way. And it also helps to make those connections between unions and the community as well. So I would just also encourage people to I think this is one of the things that I learned, not get completely sucked into this like union world, which is so easy to do. And because this work does take up so much of your time, but then, you're in a position where you're losing a lot of the time too. And so having activism and connections outside of the union is actually really healthy. And so I think in the longer term, balancing it out with something else in your life that is not perhaps as difficult is also really healthy.
One thing that I'll just mention around this topic is that I have some concern about how I think some young people today may feel that they need to take a particular job for political reasons, and then without really thinking through the questions that you've raised about actually being realistic about what kind of job you think you can be in and sustain for a number of years, right? Because I think there's the potential for people to end up doing something that's really not something that they can sustain, and then feeling quite a lot of shame around it. And I think that's not good for people as human beings, and it's not good politically, So we're not looking for martyrs when it comes to this kind of thing.
Yeah. I mean, to that point, I consider myself fortunate in that I was able to find a job that, paid decently, that I liked doing, and that I could, I could do political work at. So I had all that came together for me. It wasn't always a good job. I mean, operating a subway train can be kind of nasty, but on the whole, I liked it. I liked the people I worked with, and I was one of those people who did sort of just get sucked in completely to the union work. I didn't have the and that Katherine just described, just sort of to guard against. Well, I didn't guard against that. I was completely drawn in, so it was important for me that I had a connection through Labor Notes, the newsletter, to their conferences, and through my political organization to people who were doing other things. So I would go to a Labor Notes conference, or I would go to Solidarity Convention, and I would, I'd come back looking at some things different. I'd say, what, shit, I should have been talking about the war in Iraq more, or I should be, telling people about this other thing. And it not only energized me, but it reminded me to not just focus on, the contract fight or the shop floor fight I was engaged in.
Right. Before moving on, I would just also mention that this topic we've been talking about is connected to a topic we're not discussing in this episode, and that's the question of should socialists take jobs working for unions as staffers? If you're interested in that question, listeners, check out episode 7 of Victor's Children, which is all about that issue. Okay, so I want to ask you about what you think some of the common mistakes are that people make when people do choose jobs in order to do workplace organizing and go into thinking about this politically. What are some of the most common mistakes that people make, and how can you help people avoid making those kinds of mistakes?
I think coming back to David, the whole point of why you're putting this episode on is I wouldn't even know what mistakes folks are making because I'm not connected to people that are choosing to go into this type of work. And so why I think there's so much value in that intergenerational sharing of knowledge, because frankly, like the things that I have learned in doing this work, I have not read a lot of those things anywhere in a book or in a pamphlet. I've had to learn on my own over years, and I really would like to share that with other folks who are thinking about doing this or who are actually in the process of doing it. I think just having a realistic expectation of how difficult this work is and that it takes years and an entire, working career to make relatively minor changes, right? When you have radical politics, you're looking for bigger change. And that's, as you introduced the episode, right? Like that is not what we're talking about. And it is really, really tiring. It's a long, slow haul, and the wins are few and far in between. And so having that kind of like support network while you're doing this work internally within the union, but also through these types of forums is so important. And so if somebody's walking in with the expectation that this is how they're going to organize the revolution, like that that's just not going to happen, right? And then I think you referred to it as like not being successful and having a sense of guilt, right? It's you're one person, right? Like you can't jump over yourself. And so having a realistic expectation of how difficult this work is, and that this is not a moment where we're winning right now, right? Is I think just having realistic expectations would go a long way to supporting people to think about doing this work in the longer term.
I agree 100%. I think that, but it's also the case that sometimes major changes happen in a short period of time. And I think what's important is to recognize that's not going to happen most of the time. And it matters that you're in place to take advantage of that possibility, that you've built something that can respond. So, the best example in recent years for this kind of conversation is the changes in the UAW with the election of Shawn Fain. But clearly his election mattered. There was a strike at the Big Three. A lot of people got involved in that strike. I don't know all the changes how that is filtered through and worked its way through the union. But it's also important to realize that the core of people who made it possible for Fain to run and win had been organizing in some cases for 30 years, many of them for 5 or 10 or 15. So a big part of the reason we do the organizing and build structures that last is so that when sometimes we can push doors open, but sometimes they just open for other reasons that are beyond our control. But you're ready to take advantage of the opportunity that's presented.
Yeah, being able to have the attitude of expect the unexpected, I think, is important. It can be easy to lose sight of that when things are grinding at a very slow pace. But assuming that they will always be as one has experienced it is also a problem, right? And you can miss those opportunities when they do arise. So there are some, I think, particular issues that come up when radicals who've got university education get jobs in workplaces where none of their coworkers or very few of their coworkers have that kind of formal schooling. Sometimes this happens if people are making choices to go into certain jobs for political reasons. So any thoughts about this based on your experience or experiences of other people that you've worked with or observed?
From my personal experience, I'll say that once I made the choice to get a job in basic industry, I worked in a garment factory. I worked in a couple of chemical plants. I lied about my education in those locations to get the job. I didn't lie to my coworkers if they asked me something, but I did lie to the employer and made up, had to account for those 3 or 4 years in some way. Public employment's different. Frankly, it's just not. I worked alongside a lot of people who had some college. I worked alongside people who took this job because they could control the hours while they went to medical school or while they went to law school. So it just wasn't an issue in public employment, but in these smaller private sector things, my coworkers might wonder why I was there. I clearly could be doing something else. Why aren't you a teacher? Why aren't you whatever? It's probably easier to answer that when the economy's not doing real well, and you just say, "Man, I needed a job, and this was available." But it was really the employer that I was more concerned about, and it's probably a lot harder to get away with that now than it was in 1980.
I think a lot of it has to do with learning how to connect with people who come from a very different place in life from you, and that is a skill set that is built over time. It's figuring out, sure, you might have these ideas, and it's actually interesting, Steve, that you talked about that earlier on, but how do you actually connect that in a practical way in a milieu where people don't have those ideas, right? But might like the way that you do organizing because they feel that there's a sense of empowerment there. And beyond just like your own skill set, there is something to be said for finding folks that are leaders in those workplaces, right? Like, I think one thing that comes up is like, you're not racialized. You go into a racialized workplace, folks just intrinsically aren't going to trust you. It takes years to develop that trust, but you come in with another racialized person that can, speak the same language, and within like minutes, you have a connection with people that would take you years to build of working side by side with those folks, right? So understanding those shortcomings and figuring out different ways to connect with people, I think that's kind of what your question is getting at. And there's multiple different ways of doing that, through your own skill set, but then through also finding folks and having a trusting relationship with them and having them be able to make that connection with others as well.
As we move towards wrapping up this discussion, are there things that we haven't touched on that you think are important to address? Anything that we've missed, or anything else that you'd like to say to people who are thinking about getting involved in workplace organizing?
Other than do it, it's hard to think. I think it's when I first got a job in a chemical plant. My parents weren't thrilled about it, but they also didn't think it was a big deal because they figured, do it for a couple of years and then that'll be good for you. You'll meet all different kinds of people. You'll learn to relate to people who are different from you, and then you'll go to graduate school. Didn't work out that way, but I think it's weird. You have to have sort of this bifurcated sense of, this is what I'm going to do with my life. I want to organize. I want to build power on the job. I want to build strong unions. I want to fight the boss. But also, if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out. It's not, especially if we're talking about people who are in their 20s, who are trying to figure out what they want to do. The first job you get is probably not going to be the job you stay with. And after 5 or 10 years, you might decide, this is not what I want to do at this point in my life. I'm glad I did it, but I'm going to move on and do something else. And that's fine. So I think that if it's something that you as an individual, or you as a group of friends, or as a member of a political organization are giving serious thought to, then find a way to make it happen and see where that takes you.
Just remembering that a lot of this is also trial and error, right? So yeah, do it. Things will work out. You'll try a different approach. I can't overemphasize how important it is to do it with a group of folks and having a community, a support network, whatever that organization looks like for you. But also, I think, again, I come back to, I don't think we have those kinds of support systems in place. And I don't think we have organizations or even spaces, really, they're so far and few in between, to be able to support folks who are just entering into this kind of work, or sharing the experience that some of us have from doing this over years. So I just, again, David, really want to thank you for creating this space. And I know I'll be looking for more opportunities to share some of that experience and knowledge that I've been able to accumulate through what I would say is years of hard work, because it shouldn't just be lost, right? I want to support others who are doing this work as well, or thinking about it.
Thanks very much to both of you for sharing your experience and your thoughts on these questions. It's really helpful. And
thank you, David. Nice to meet you, Katherine.
Nice to meet you, Steve. Thanks again, David.
Good luck.
Thank you.
That's it for this episode of Victor's Children. I'd like to thank Jonathan Croker, the producer of Victor's Children, without whom the podcast wouldn't be possible. I'd also like to thank Posey Legg, who designed the graphic for Victor's Children. If you found the episode worth listening to, please do tell other people about the show, since word-of-mouth recommendations are especially helpful. If you don't subscribe through your preferred podcast app, please do. And while you're there, please give the show a high rating. It helps to promote us. If you have a suggestion for an episode or some other kind of constructive feedback, feel free to be in touch with me. You can contact me through victorschildren@gmail.com.